Very strange things happen in and around fairy forts. They are a great place to cross paths with fairy, and no doubt, but the vast majority of interactions with fairy in and around fairy forts are at best disturbing and at worst deadly. You've been warned. Now, to show you what I mean, here are 8 true stories from Ireland. There was a neighbour of mine who was coming home from a fair in his cart. It was dark, but not very late. There was a fort sitting close by the road that he was travelling. All was quiet as he was passing by the fort, but once he had passed it, a horde of fairies came out and rushed at the cart. The ass pulling the cart froze and could not be moved. Some of the fairy climbed into the cart, and the man tried desperately to pull them out of it. Other fairies were pulling hard on the cart, trying to pull the cart and ass toward the graveyard. The ass resisted the pull and moved forward on the road, at which the fairies fell away and were not seen again. The man died 3 days later and was buried in that very graveyard. There is a fort in a townland near Ballinasloe. A young man from this district was coming home one night and heard music playing from inside the fort. He was fond of dancing and, unable to resist the temptation, started dancing to the fairies' music. A woman came from the fort, stood before him, and started dancing with him. She kept him dancing without pause until cock-crow next morning. When he went home in the morning, he fell sick and died. One time, as it was about the middle of the night, my father and my uncle were going to a fair with pigs in a cart. The ass that would pull the cart was out in the field, but no one knew which field he was in. It was a bright night, and my uncle went looking into one field which was near the house, and my father went to the field which was near the fort. As my father walked around looking for the ass, my uncle could see him, and he thought he could see another man walking around with my father. At last my father got the ass, and he brought him down to the house and called for my uncle. My uncle came into the house and asked my father who was the man that was walking around with him when he was looking for the ass in the field. My father said there was no man in the field, only himself, and was certain he would have seen a man walking beside him. But my uncle swore on his life he saw the man clearly walking at my father's shoulder. They talked a long while on the subject and decided it was a fairy from the fort that walked with my father in the field. Many people were frightened at night when they passed by a particular fort on my uncle's farm. One time, a man named Patrick Comer was coming home from Meerlik, where he had been visiting, to Kilmore, where his own house was. He came across my uncle's fields, and as he came near the fort, he stood looking around himself because the night was bright and he wanted to take a good look at that fort. He could see many things, he said, until suddenly a great darkness came over the place and he was unable to see a thing. He couldn't even see where he was walking. Not knowing what else to do, he let out a loud roar, and suddenly the darkness lifted and he was surrounded by great brightness. When Comer looked around himself, he saw a fairy only feet away staring at him. He got afraid then, and he started walking very quickly towards his house, but the fairy followed close behind him, walking just as quick. When Coma opened his door to enter the house, the fairy was standing at the door right behind him. Coma told the fairy to come into his house, but the fairy said, "No, I will be going." In Lawrence Ryan's garden in Turla, there is an old fort. One night, Thomas Quinn and his father were bringing their cattle to a fair in Williamstown for to sell the next morning. As they were passing Ryan's, the gate to his garden was open. The cattle suddenly moved toward the gate, intent on entering, but as the cattle approached, the gate closed itself from the inside. No one was seen, but the fort was just inside the gate. There are many fairy forts in our district. In Rossdale there is a square fort surrounded by blackthorn bushes. One day, Owen Griffin went to cut one of these bushes to put in a gap of a fence. He first cut the hanging branches and then started to cut the tree when suddenly the hatchet he was holding was fiercely taken out of his hand and he never saw it again. In Morgan's Land in Keelogues there is another old fort. One day a crowd of men were saving hay about a mile away from this fort. As they worked, a whirlwind came along and raised one of the men's waistcoat right off his back and carried it along all the way to the fort. At dinner time, the owner of the waistcoat went out to get it. When he got outside, he looked up to see it coming back right toward him on the air again. There are many forts in this district and there are many stories connected with them. One day, 2 men were digging potatoes in one of our forts. It was situated a few miles from their home, so they had taken their luncheon with them. At about 1 o'clock, they went over to the end of the field to sit and eat their dinner. When they were sitting down, 3 small women appeared from, they said, somewhere out of the ground and began picking the potatoes and putting them in their aprons. The men were afraid to say anything to them because they knew that they were the good people. So they just sat in silence. The 3 small women stayed about a half an hour picking the potatoes, and then they disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. After some time and much thought, the men went back to the place they had been digging, thinking that all the potatoes would be gone, but to their surprise, there were none of them gone. Still, the men were very much afraid. They didn't stay late that evening because they feared the women would come back again. But though they worked near that fort often, they never saw the women again. I have a strange story about our fort. One day, when my father was an old man, he was passing by the fort on our land and he heard lovely music coming from inside it. He stopped to listen and after a while he saw 4 beautiful young girls coming out of the fort. Each of them, he said, had a very thin stick in their hand. They came over to my father and began hitting him on the back of his head with these sticks until he was sore and bleeding. He was struck senseless with fear, but after a short while he managed to run away. Do you know he could never warm the back of his head again? no matter what he tried from that day until the day he died. I'm Kitty, and I post a brand new video every Friday, so check back with me then for more true fairy encounters. Sending big love across the oceans to all my gorgeous patrons. And until next time, I hope you will stay curious and be kind. Cheerio!